Ryan here with E39 Source. We're on a 2000 E39 M5 today, and we're going to be doing diff bushings. Oh, this is going to be a joyous day. I can already feel it. Nate's there too. Hi, Nate. So let's start off by talking about what I've already done, kind of a brief overview of what we're going to do, and we're going to focus more detail on the tricky stuff, pushing the differential bushings in and out of the rear subframe. Your general things, getting the car in the air and taking the wheels off. If you're considering DIYing diff bushings, I'm going to assume that you already know how to safely do that. We do have the rear wheels removed. Front ones are optional. I just happen to have them off. You don't need to remove the front wheels. Obviously, the differential bushings are what hold your rear differential into the rear subframe. There's a total of 3. There's 2 in the rear, which we can see one of right there, and if I had light on that, you'd see how cracked it is. These can be relatively easily inspected visually for wear. If you see cracking, chunks missing, if it's dry, it's time to replace them. And under heavy load, you can actually feel the rear end of the car get loose or make noise.
The crack right up at the top there.
Yeah, this one's pretty bad. So this is a 2000 M5, 136,000 miles on it. And both rear bushings are cracked, and the front one is a little bit as well. And the front one is right there.
It's on the passenger side of the differential on the front.
Right. So we're going to need to, the way we're going to do this is removing the differential, but not the subframe. We're going to leave the subframe in the car. The vast majority of the rear suspension will stay in the car, or at least stay attached to the car. We may need to disconnect the strut from the wheel carriers. We'll see about that. But obviously the differential is going to have to come down so we can access those bushings. So what needs to happen for the diff to come down? Well, step 1 will be exhaust removal. This car has factory exhaust. It's I guess it has been cut because the cats were replaced under warranty, so there's clamps here in the center section. But the exhaust is held onto the car kind of in 3 different places. Up front, where your pipes meet your headers, your exhaust manifolds. And these bolts are going to be the trickiest to work with because they're exposed to a lot of heat. They're exposed to any sort of elements in the way of salt, snow, water, oil leaks, whatever gets on them. And if you put a gun on them and pull the trigger, they're probably just going to spin and break off like the ones that I tried yesterday did. If you can get some, yeah, and Nate's. If you can get some PB blaster in there, it can't hurt, but it's not going to make a world of difference. So we'll need to separate all 4 connections here. Then we come back to the transmission. I guess this is a 4th point of attachment. And you have a couple options here. You can just disconnect this entire bracket from the transmission. There's 2 13mm bolts. You could disconnect it here. You could disconnect it here. This looks pretty crusty. I'm going to leave that. So I'm just going to disconnect it. In fact, I already have right up there. Moving back. The next point of attachment, mechanical attachment. There's some electrical attachments we'll talk about in a moment. But your next mechanical attachment is right here. And generally there is an exhaust brace here that goes back and forth. There's 2 13mm nuts that hold the brace onto these mounts. If your mounts are red, that means they're original and they're crap. They should be replaced. Newer mounts are black and are better built and last longer. This is the brace. And the brace was just bolted up there.
13 mils.
And then you have your chassis braces on an M5, which share these outer bolts. So there's 13, 13, 13, 13. Then your 2 13mm nuts hold these red or black exhaust mounts bushings to the center brace. So you'll want to remove all of those bolts. Following the chassis braces back here to the front rear subframe mounts, there's another 13mm bolt, and this bolt's very long, about the length of my finger, and it goes up through a black plastic cover, as I'll call it, and that's going to be the back half of your chassis braces, and that's the bolt right there. So this is everything I removed yesterday. These are the 2 chassis braces. That's where it meets the center exhaust brace. These are the black plastic covers I talked about with a 13mm bolt there and another 13 that comes up through there. Center exhaust brace. And then your last point of attachment for the exhaust will be back here at your mufflers. There's a total of 6 on each side, or 12 total, 13mm nuts that hold your exhaust mounts up to these studs that come out of the chassis. And these are quite easy to get to. Maybe you'll need a swivel or some wobble extensions over here just because the bumper is a little bit in the way, but it's no big deal. So obviously don't take all of it down at once. The exhaust will come crashing down on you, and it's quite a heavy system. In fact, it's huge. That right there sticking up is an uncut factory exhaust system. And the whole thing is quite heavy and cumbersome and really should have at least 2 people, 3 would be optimal. So what I've done is just leave a couple of the nuts in back here, just enough to hold it up there safely. Obviously I have that point of attachment completely undone. I have this point of attachment completely undone. And then there's just a few more bolts holding the headers in, which we're probably going to have to cut and grind and drill out. Now we'll talk about electrical attachments, and those would be your 4 oxygen sensors. If your car is a early 2000 and you have original cats, you'll have a 5th sensor known as an exhaust gas temperature sensor. This car is a 2000, it's located right here. These cats have been replaced and don't have the sensor anymore, so we don't have to worry about that. You could unscrew the sensor from the pipe. I don't recommend that. Usually they're very tight. It's easiest to just remove this little black cover, which is installed on these 2 studs in the chassis. They're 2 black 10mm nuts, and then just disconnect your sensors and let them hang. So these are going to come off with the exhaust.
Just a note, you cannot plug them in backwards because they are different connectors for different O2 sensors.
Yes, very good to know. They only fit the right way. And then the rear sensors are just held onto this heat insulation here in these little clips. So just let those release and let the wires hang from the exhaust so it can come down all as one big piece. So here's the exhaust system off the car. We removed the nuts in the back. I had 3 people. Guy on each muffler and the 3rd guy in the front. That's going to be your sticky point. Right up here with those 4. So kind of lower it in the back. Be careful around the bumper, around the diffuser, especially with these outermost points because they're going to want to fall down and hit the bumper and you don't want to crack your bumper. So be careful with that. And then you're going to have the guys in the back here are going to do all the work. Your guy on these tips or mufflers, these tips and mufflers are going to lower it, kind of rock it back and forth while the guy in the front pushes, and then eventually you get the whole system off the car like this. From there, that revealed all of the underbody heat shielding, all the different pieces of heat shielding that come down with a bunch of 8mm bolts. Very simple. There's a couple in here. Maybe there's a total of 6 and 3 different pieces. Those come out of the way. And then you've got your drive shaft. And your drive shaft is held in with several attachment points. Up front, it attaches to the transmission with a black rubber disc called a Guibo or flex disc. You only need to remove 3 of the bolts. You can leave the flex disc either attached to the drive shaft, as we did, or on the output shaft of the transmission, as seen right there. They're 21mm bolts with 21mm nuts on the back. So counter hold and then use a wrench or an impact gun and pull those out. Next, in the middle, on these 2 studs, will be 13mm nuts holding the center support bearing up. Center support bearing goes around the drive shaft and supports the center of it near the U-joint. Inspect that bearing. If there's any play or it's clicking, you should replace it. Now is a really good time to do that. Then the last and final point of attachment for the drive shaft is back here at the differential input shaft. There's a total of 6 16mm nuts that will need to be loosened. You'll have to keep turning the drive shaft, so neutralize the transmission, and keep turning it around until you're able to access all 6 nuts.
Life pro tip, if you need to neutralize the transmission and you can't get enough leverage on it, you can usually put a wrench on either side of the shifter cup here and just push the transmission into neutral.
Yeah, you can shift a car from down here. Not for the best lap times, but it'll work in this case. And then the last thing on this thing here is to separate the drive shaft from this input shaft. There's 2 little notches in it at 6 o'clock and 12 o'clock. Obviously that'll depend on how yours is oriented, but you just put a big flathead screwdriver in there and twist it, and that'll separate your drive shaft from the differential. And the drive shaft is here. That's the flex disc or Guibo I talked about right there. I just left it attached to the drive shaft since I'm not replacing it. There's the center support bearing in the U-joint, and then this is the end that went into the differential.
You see the flats for the screwdriver right there.
Up next, we need to remove the axles. The axles are held into the differential output shafts with a total of, is it 6?
I believe so.
7, 8, 6 or 7, 8 something. External torques, and I believe they're E14s. So it's a bolt that looks like these. And you'll just need to loosen those. And again, you need to keep rotating the differential output shafts so you can access them. It's only going to work in one specific way. Now, once that's done, your axle shaft is disconnected from the differential. What we're using here is a Harbor Freight 2-ton safety stand. We lifted up the rear suspension by the ball joint, just enough that we were able to slide the axle. Nate was able to slide the axle out of the differential output shaft. So we're going to do the same thing on the other side, and I'll show you a little bit of what that process looks like. right on the ball joint. That's about the strongest point of this rear suspension in order
If you
to
got
lift.
the tire on, you can push it from the tire too.
Yeah, the tire would be fine. You could also use the rotor hat here, but you got to be careful it doesn't slip out. You definitely don't want to do that on a lift. So we're just raising it up so the angle is a little bit better, so the axle can detach.
The drive shaft runs into the front part of, or this the axle shaft runs into the front part of this control arm otherwise. So now that this is lifted up a bit, you're going to slide the CV boot joint back as far as you can and just sneak it by the output shaft here. Now this is also how you remove the output shafts without taking the entire diff out of the car if you're just doing these diff seals.
Beautiful. Once the differential is disconnected from the axles and the drive shaft, we're ready to drop the differential out of the car. The differential is held in with 3 points. Each one of them has the bushing that we're replacing today. So there's one back here in the rear right, there's one in the rear left, and there's the one we talked about before on the passenger side in the front. All of these points will need to be accessed. In order to do that, the differential needs to come down a little bit. We're not taking the subframe out of the car, but we are going to lower it about an inch-ish. So what we've done back here on these main bolts that hold the subframe up to the chassis, these are 21mm bolts, we remove them one at a time. You cannot remove more than one of these at once. The subframe will flex. So remove one of the bolts and then turn it in, thread it back in about 10 full rotations. Maybe go 11 just to be safe. Do the same thing on the rear left mount. So the rear subframe bolts are in about 10 turns, and as you can see, that's given us all this extra room here, probably in the neighborhood of about 3/4 of an inch. Then we're able to put an 18mm socket on a breaker bar, counter hold the nut on the back, and on the front, Nate came over here and drove the 18mm bolt with a socket and ratchet combination, 1/2-inch drive impact grade tools. And we've got that point already completely detached. So now we can move over here to the driver's side, again on the rear bushing, and do the same thing. Although note, now we have a lot more room, seeing that this battery well and box is not in the way. So again, we'll counter hold the 18mm nut and drive out the bolt on the other side. Now, important to note, leave the bolt in there, because if you completely remove that and then remove this, you're liable of dropping the entire diff out of the car or breaking the front subframe mount, which would just be miserable. So leave the bolt in so it can attach to something. The frontmost differential mount is a 21mm nut on the back, 21mm nut in the front. We counter held the back of it with a breaker bar and socket, and then just put a big impact gun on the front and spun it loose.
And we did remove this heat shield.
And yeah, we did pull off that last piece of heat shielding, which was held in with 4 10mm sheet metal nuts. Which gave us access to get the gun in there. Anyways, the differential is only being held to the subframe right now, essentially with gravity and just the 3 bolts. The nuts are gone. So we have the bolt in each mount. So what we're going to do now is lower the car down towards the ground and then use one of these transmission jacks. We're going to spin that all the way up, tie the differential to it, slide the nuts out, and then we'll have the diff out of the car.
Lift the car up.
Lift the car up, leave the diff on the ground. Here's what things look like. The majority of the weight is in the front of the differential. As Nate points out, that's where the pinion is.
Yeah, the pinion is really heavy.
So that's where we want to put the majority of the weight. I've just used the lift to very slowly and gently lower the car and the differential onto the transmission jack. We're going to put this nylon strap up around the top of the diff, so hopefully it doesn't fall off, and ratchet it down. Here's our differential. Ratchet strapped to the transmission jack, and then we also supported the rear end of it with a normal, just a Harbor Freight jack, some wood, and the cooling fins. So we slowly raised the car. It's a little tricky to slide the bolts out. If there's too much weight on the diff being pushed up or pulled down, the bolts don't want to slide out, so play with your jack and your lift and here and what the car is on. Slide the bolts out, and then we just raised the car and left the diff like this. So now we'll move it out of here, put it down on the ground safely, and get to the meat and potatoes, the actual mounts in the subframe. We're going to start by doing the front bushing. And this is a kit that I will link in the description below. This is from eBay in the United Kingdom. And supposedly it's the best tool to use for pressing these bushings in and out of the subframe. So we'll let you know what setup is going to work best for this. So this is going to be one action of pressing the new bushing in and pulling the old bushing out for the front differential bushing. And the bushing we're putting in right now is a unicorn egg. I will link that down below. It is a solid bushing that decreases your need for front mount reinforcement, and it's just going to be a part that lasts infinitely longer than the standard stock rubber bushing. I'll put the part number and the link to that part, as I said, down below. I'll do the same for the rear. We are using Lemporter OEM rear bushings, but this tool so far is working absolutely beautifully for this front bushing. As I said, I'll link the tool down below, and then I encourage you to open up the booklet that comes with it, find the English, and assemble it as instructed. Because this is working really well. We're driving it with a 22 mil. If you have a ratcheting 22 mil box wrench, that would be ideal. Mine only go up to 19, so we're just doing it the slow way, but this is still very smooth. We got that unicorn egg there installed in the front mount. The tool worked really well for that. And you know, there's not a front and a back per se. We did kind of put it in backwards per Jed's recommendations, but it's identical. It's a mirror image of itself. It doesn't matter. For the rear mounts, Nate's been working on that. This one over here has a lot more space. It's a little bit easier. I'll let you take over.
I basically removed these bolts all the way. Like you can see, this is just finger tight.
On the subframe bolt.
In there. So the subframe is tilted down on the front mounts. Front mount bolts are still fully tight, so it's not in any danger of crashing on your head. And we've still got the shocks attached, so it's not going to cause any problem there. So what I had to do, though, is trim down a little bit of the threading on the inside of that bushing. We'll show you that when we get the tool out. And that just allows you to sneak this rear bushing into your up under the gaps in the unibody here. So there's just barely enough room to get in there. So now we're just going to basically turn this big wrench and turn it clockwise a whole bunch of times, and it'll press the old bushing out. Now the difference between the back bushings and the front bushing, the front bushing you press the old one out and the new one in simultaneously. The back bushings you press the old ones out and then you press the new ones in, so it's double the process. But this is really smooth, like it's just like one draw through. This one, there's just not enough room. I'm sure if you actually had this off the car you could do it in one press, but because it's in the air on the unibody, it's not quite as easy.
To gain access to this right rear differential mount, we've gone ahead and completely dropped the subframe down off of its mounts, removing both 21mm bolts. And this has actually bought us a ton of room.
I would recommend when you do that, have a safety stand or a jack or something to catch it and lower it slowly. That way you're not putting any tension on these brake lines. These are tight, but they're not taut.
Right. So definitely be careful with that. We've also loosened the front ones. The front ones we've dropped the front of the subframe down, say a half an inch, three-quarter inch. And then the back obviously is down about 3 inches. And that's allowing us to use this tool. And in the rear, as we mentioned before, it's a two-step process. We're pushing the old bushing out, and then the new bushing comes in. Yeah. In these new bushings, I'm going to show you the old ones right now because they're down here. There's an opening there. See, it's at 6 and 12 o'clock. That's the way they go. They don't go like this. They don't go like that. They need to go like this. And then the back has the cup, whereas the front has the protrusion.
And you can see if you're installing it, the tool is going to block your view of these. You can see which part is up because this little flat part is on the side. So the flats go on the side, press it in.
Differential reassembly is quite tricky. We used the same setup we had before. We supported the rear cooling fin part of the differential with that jack, and then used the scissor lift over there, which is now collapsed on the majority of it. The problem is with this scissor lift jack, it has a valley there in the center. And the drain or fill bolt, the drain bolt on the differential was falling into that, and it took the differential and tilted it to the left, which made reassembly extremely difficult. If you don't have that problem, your goal should be to get the differential roughly in place, work around your axles, and just get one or two, just put the bolts in, slide the bolts through, put some nuts on hand tight, get it in here, then raise the car back up, and we can tighten everything to spec, which I'm about to look up. Right now we're at the point where we have the 3 bolts through, hand tight nuts on both rear mounts and the one front. We've got the axles reseated in the differential output flanges, and we're going to start replacing the external Torx bolts holding the axles to the differential. And we'll get these tightened down, and I'll have a torque spec for you here in the next clip. Torques, we're at 78 foot-pounds on the rear mounts, and you want to do the rears before the fronts. I used the torque wrench to drive from the front. We counter-held the back, just like we did for removal. For the front mounting point, we're looking at 110 foot-pounds. It's quite a lot of torque. Same thing, I drove it from the front here with this view, looking at the front of the differential, and counter-held the 21 from the back. So with that, the differential is installed, the bushings are in, the bushings are solid. At this point, we're going to reinstall the axles, put the E14s back in. I'll look up the torque spec for that. We have some driveshaft service that we're going to be doing here today as well with center support bearing. The flex disc was already done, and then the leveling guide pin in the front of the driveshaft we're going to figure out as well. Then we've already done shifter work, whole shifter rebuild, 545i shifter. This is absolutely the time to do that. Transmission mounts would be easier now as well. It's just a good time to do a lot of this stuff when the car is this far taken apart. 59 foot-pounds is our magic number here on the axles. They're a little bit frustrating to torque down, just as when I removed them yesterday. You have to keep climbing up in the car, release the parking brake, pull the parking brake. Obviously putting it in gear right now isn't going to make a hill of beans a difference because we don't have a drive shaft connecting the transmission and the differential, so you just have to keep moving it around, seeing as you can really only access bolts on this side. Other than that, 59 pound-feet, 6 on this side, 6 on the other side. Even though the differential bushing removal tool is specifically made for the E39 and I think the E38, there is still a modification that we've had to make to this tool, and that's been just grinding down about an inch of the threads with the smooth part of the rod here. You need to take that about another inch, and we just used an angle grinder with a cutting bit on the end and an angle, and of course safety glasses, and grind that smooth.
Optionally, you could cut it down about an inch here as well. This is for the length of the bushing in the rear of the subframe.
It worked completely fine unmodified for the front bushing.
Yes,
it's for the rear bushing.
This is for the rear bushing. So we took about an inch of the threads down to just flat. And then if you cut this off about an inch, you can do this with the subframe in the car. Otherwise, we did make a few scratches in the front of the rear subframe, which you could avoid by cutting this by about an inch. To me, it doesn't really matter that much, but if you wanted a perfect tool with a perfect job, you could chop about an inch out of that. No one's ever going to notice the difference. This is still a perfectly serviceable tool.
Hey, the car's over here now. We're all done. So I'm going to kind of wrap this video up, tell you a couple torques, a little bit of instruction on reassembly. First thing you want to make sure you go ahead and torque after those axles to the differential output shafts will be the rear subframe. Those 4 21mm huge bolts that attach the rear subframe to the chassis, importantly, need to go down to 103 foot-pounds of torque. The next spec will be the drive shaft to the differential. That's the CV joint with the 6 16mm nuts, and that's going to be 47 foot-pounds. And lastly, the drive shaft to the transmission or the flex disc, all of those 6 fastening points there, the 3 that hold the flex disc to the transmission and the other 3 that hold the other side of the flex disc to the drive shaft, will be down at 73 foot-pounds of torque. Regarding reinstallation, it's the same process in which it all came apart. Get that drive shaft back in there. I just gave you the torque specs for that. The 2 13mm nuts that hold the center support bearing up in the middle of the drive shaft, tight, not crazy, don't wail on them, but make sure they're tight. That support bearing does need to be installed in a way, it's obvious when you look at it, there's some arrows that or some little holes that need to match up. I forget exactly what that looked like. But you want to make sure that that bearing isn't being forced forwards too far or forced backwards too far. That will shorten the service life of the bearing, so make sure that that's in there. The heat shielding goes back in, of course, some of it before the drive shaft. I think some of it maybe goes on afterwards. The center exhaust brace, the chassis braces, all of that stuff, just make it good and snug. Exhaust reinstallation was kind of the same as removing it. We had 3 guys. I did note that maybe start with the back and just kind of sandwich it up in there and then pull it back, so you don't have to remove the bumper or worry about smashing the corners of it. Then I had a guy, the 3rd guy, go up front. That was Nate. He put new hardware in there. We just went over to Lowe's and bought some new stainless bolts. Make sure they're the right size, the right threads, or buy some nuts with them. Tighten that up good and tight, and we're done. It was a long day. It was a full 16-hour Saturday here in the shop, but what a difference. After doing all of that, no more clunks in the rear end at all. It's super tight, super smooth. Couldn't be happier with the transformation from differential bushings. So as you've seen in this video, it's a pretty involved process. It's not impossible with the right tools. I am going to go ahead and say that a lift is required. Yeah, you can do it without it, but I wouldn't want to do that. So you really need a lift. You need jack, scissor jack, or like a transmission jack to hold the differential. Obviously, your sockets. Impact tools make a profound difference in the amount of time and effort it takes to undo things like exhaust systems and chassis braces and transmissions, and just all of this stuff is so much easier if you've got a nice DeWalt, 1,200-pound gun or something like that. So that's the DIY. If you have any questions, please leave them down below. Feel free to shoot me an email, ryan@e39source.com. Be sure to check out the description below this video. I will put all of the part numbers, all the torque specs that I have, everything down there in text, so it's all in one place. You can copy and paste it somewhere, or just refer to that. And again, thank you for watching. We'll talk in the next E39 Source video. Take care.